Csatlakozhatok akkor a PPT-vel?
Yes, that's the time.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's a podcast. Formally, it's declared that its name is Wesley Lectures, but the Wesley Lectures practically mean it's a podcast of different scholars who are belonging to the John Wesley Theological College of Budapest. And the greatest part of our scholars specialized for 19th and 20th century history, church history, sociology of church, and so on. And in this meaning, Olbei Tamas, Olbei, it's a kind of unicum that he is the first scholar in our community who is specialized for Middle Age history. Something happened, but he will come back again, I hope. So that's the he is a medievalist, and one or 2 weeks before it was a lecture in Hungarian language, which concentrated for the Christian war and for the social history, not especially church history, but the social history of the relations of great companies in a concrete and specialized period of the Christian war, and not in the main front, so not in Jerusalem, but in the role of great companies and conflicts of the great companies and medieval society in the 14th century France. Today he came from another topic, and it will be in English, so perhaps it will be a little more interesting for our foreign auditors who will come to here and hear him cross the YouTube. Tamas, it's your flow.
Thank you very much, dear Peter and dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give these 2 lectures as part of the Wesley Lectures. Today we'll discuss the background to the lecture given in Hungarian. I already mentioned some first few thoughts of the introduction in Hungarian in the previous presentation, but for those who do not speak our language, it might be useful to recall them. The topic will be the preparation and execution of a special crusade from among the late medieval crusades. This crusade is unique because of its participants, who were none other than mercenaries. As this lecture is being held at the Wesley Research Center for Sociology of Church and Religion, today's lecture will focus on the role of the church in the preparation of the crusades. By the mid-14th century, mercenaries had become a dominant, inescapable factor in late medieval warfare. A significant part of the peoples of Europe had experienced their presence and had daily encounters which profoundly changed their mindset and the sense of security, as the many examples found in the different European archives and chronicles show. The emergence of paid armies, the effect of putting warfare on a contractual basis instead of tenurial obligations and communal services, extended to all aspects of life. In addition to the economic, military, political and social consequences, we can examine the psychological, cultural changes resulting from the interactions between the population and the mercenaries, or the impact of the mercenaries, of the presence of the foreign mercenaries on perhaps less obvious aspects of life, such as fashion. For example, the caps worn by the mercenaries passing through brought a new fashion among the people of Alsace in 1365. By the 1360s, multi-ethnic mercenary companies were roaming the European theatres of war as a result of concluding contracts of longer or shorter duration with rulers and princesses, lords and ladies, cities, and, of course, the church. Following the Treaty of Bretigny, the 6th May 1360, that concluded the first phase of the 100 Years' War, they became so numerous that the problems the mercenaries meant were beyond the means of any country. A solution had to be sought on a European level to deal with the devastation caused by the dismissed companies, the discharged brigands. The rival monarchies of Europe had to join forces with the papacy to try to find a solution to the problem of the routier. 3 series of events led to the organization of 4 interlinked crusades between 1362 and 66. The first one was the growing Ottoman threat in the Levante and, more specifically, the emergence of the Ottomans in Europe. The second was the already mentioned dominance of mercenary companies in Italy and France. The third was a dynastic conflict between 2 half-brothers on the Iberian Peninsula, Enrique of Trastamara and Pedro the Cruel, King of Castile. This was an integral part of the rivalry between Castile and Aragon, the long conflict of the mid-14th century called by later historians the War of the Two Pedros. The joint project of 2 popes, kings, princesses and an emperor culminated in the 4 crusades that changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people from the Iberian Peninsula to the Black Sea via the African coast in 1366. These unprecedented campaigns with highly unusual participants contributed to the rise to power of a new dynasty in Castile, the sacking of Alexandria and Gallipoli, the destruction of the borderlands between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, and the destruction of the Bulgarian coastal cities. These 4 campaigns have common roots, common participants, common objectives, and interconnected plans in their preparation. The lecture traces the political history of the 3 years leading up to the Crusades, which took Bertrand de Guesclin, Constable of France, to Iberia, Peter of Lusignan, King of Cyprus, to Alexandria, Amadeus VI, the Green Count of Savoy, to the Balkans, and Arnaud de Serval, the Archpriest, to the borderland of the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, often involving coincidence, sometimes personal decisions, or political machinations. By tracing the events from the last snow 1362 to the spring of 1365, it is possible to understand the complexity and diversity of the undertaking involved in organizing 1 crusade, let alone 4. Nevertheless, to understand what this meant for the Church and how the sovereigns and lords involved in preparing and in part carrying out the crusades experienced the events, it is necessary to study a chapel and its frescoes in Florence. The Santa Maria Novella and its chapter house has traditionally been the center of the Dominican order in Florence more than 6 centuries. The church is marked by the presence of the Dominicans, the solar emblem on its interior decoration, as well as the black and white Dominicanes at the feet of the Pope and the Emperor, who guard a flock of faithful in Andrea di Buonaiuto's fresco in the Spanish chapel. The master was commissioned to paint the Via Veritatis in the Spanish chapel between 1366 and 68. The fresco cycle of the Spanish chapel heralds the resurgence of the crusading idea in the mid-14th century, partly in response to the Ottoman threat to the eastern frontier of Christendom, and partly as a result of the devastation by the Ruggi in France and Italy. At the same time, of course, the Via Veritatis is a compendious representation of the Dominican success story. The work of art began in January 1366 by Andrea di Buonaiuto's during the Four Crusades, adorns the eastern hall of the chapel. Christ is placed in the upper third of the fresco, flanked by the crowned Virgin Mary holding a stern of white lilies surrounded by singing angels. Below them, in the central part of the fresco, Andrea di Buonaiuto painted the preparers and executors of the Crusades with Florence Cathedral in the background. Pope Urban V is seated next to Emperor Charles IV, accompanied by Gilles de Albornoz, Peter of Lusignan, Amadeus VI, and Raymond de Berenger. Brother Raymond was the Grand Master of the Knights of Rhodes from 1365 to 74, and joined the King of Cyprus in the Alexandrian campaign. The Via Veritatis is intended to show the close relationship between the Church and the Dominican order, which aimed to eradicate heresy. In fact, between 1360 and 66, Innocent VI and Urban V issued a series of papal bulls against mercenaries as heretics, who were banished from the bosom of the Church with severe anathemas. By the time Andrea di Buonaiuto had finished the frescoes in the Spanish chapel, the characters in the fresco had been through 2 successful crusades. Thanks to Gilles de Alborno's tireless campaign over a decade and a half, Urban V and Charles IV marched together into Rome in 1368, a feat that had only been achieved a century earlier. It is no coincidence that the participants in the fresco are depicted together, side by side, for the Pope and the Emperor, by actively participating in the preparation of the Crusades, have the 2 atleti intrepidi Christi, Amadeus VI and Peter I, to perform a feat admirable in the eyes of their contemporaries. Of course, persons like Arnaud de Serval or Bertrand du Guesclin, who led the 2 other crusades, were the embodiment of mercenaries in the mid-14th century, could not have been included in the fresco. In church politics, the use of excommunication as one of the primary instruments for dealing with mercenaries in the mid-14th century coincided with the emergence of the great companies. In this way, excommunication was used to maintain social order by punishing with an anathema anyone who attacked churches or other ecclesial properties, priests or persons in the service of the church. The peace of God was first applied in Provence by Rimbaud de Rélion, Archbishop of Arles. He cursed anyone who committed violence from Wednesday evening to Monday morning, extended the period to all church holidays. Ironically, Provence was also the region where Arnaud de Serval, with the first French great company, destroyed, robbed, and ransomed a series of ecclesial estates in 1357 and 58. Of course, papal policy was much more complicated in reality. It was Cardinal Talleyrand Périgord, one of the most influential ecclesiastical politicians of his time, who had supported and prepared Arnaud de Serval's arrival in Provence. The Pope would have cursed Arnaud de Serval only if he had attacked territories belonging directly to the Papal States. Again, realpolitik played a part, as the departure of the leader of the great company operating in the immediate vicinity of defenseless Avignon was rather paid by gold and However much the archpriest's presence threatened Avignon, he was not excommunicated. The negotiations between Naples and Arnaud de Serval were even mediated by Innocent VI. Not long after that, thanks to Arnaud de Serval, the walls of Avignon were quickly rebuilt, so Innocent VI was a little more courageous in 1361 in his dealing with the mercenaries who occupied Pont-Saint-Esprit. This time, the Pope excommunicated the mercenary troops. However, in Italy, much further away from Avignon, in 1357, where the Holy See was not under direct threat, excommunication was applied more freely than in the case of Arnaud de Serval. Conrad for Landau's Great Company was found guilty of fautoria heresiae for fighting alongside Francesco Ordelaffi by Gilles d'Arbonos. The Cardinal Legate used the power of excommunication against the companies on several occasions. In 1364, for example, he cursed Johann Hanneken Bongart's company when he was informed that the German condottiere was planning to attack the Papal States. Calling the company Pestifera Societas, he cursed everyone up to third generation who had the mercenaries. Urban V excommunicated Seguin de Badajoz company, the Margot, twice, also in 1364 for the capture of Brioude, and on the 19th January 1365 for the capture of Annecy. The examples given so far have shown, without claiming to be exhaustive, how often in the papal practice of excommunication against the mercenaries during the period Innocent VI and Urban V, or their legates, punished or threatened a captain or his company with an ecclesiastical curse. In these cases, it was partly a preventive measure, such as the threat of excommunication in the case of Arnaud de Serval to dissuade him from attacking Avignon. The same was done by Gilles d'Arbonos with Johann Hanneken Bongard. It was of course much more common for excommunication to be used after the event as a reprisal for crimes committed by a captain. Less frequently, however, the Pope did not curse a specific company, but excommunicated all mercenaries active in a particular region or area at a particular time. This was the case in Italy on the 13th April 1366 when Urban V excommunicated all the companies. Emperor Charles received directives from Urban V to augment this condemnation with the imperial ban. Charles was further tasked with rallying the German and Italian states into a cohesive alliance. In terms of consequences, even if not very ineffective, the excommunications certainly did not stop mercenaries from enforcing their will. Ecclesiastical curse did not deter the inhabitants of the occupied territories from severing their financially beneficial ties with the companies. The population who maintained contact with the mercenaries sought relief from the ecclesiastical curse whenever they could. Both the church and the companies used excommunication as a bargaining chip in their dealings with each other. Seguin de Badajoz, at the surrender of both Annecy and Brioude, made sure that the papal excommunication was waived in the treaty of the surrender of the cities. In Poitou, on the 17th March 1358, the canon of Saint-Hilaire de Poitiers was kidnapped by the mercenaries on his way to Avignon. They deprived him of his money and his horse and locked him up in the castle of Reuillet until they extorted a promise from him to pay a ransom for several thousand florins. On the orders of Innocent VI, the Archbishop of Bordeaux excommunicated the mercenaries who occupied several monasteries until they received the promise of papal absolution. The best example Even excommunicating a mercenary captain was not always so easy, and sometimes the Pope acted cautiously. The best example for the controversial papal policy toward the mercenaries is that in 1361 the papacy even excommunicated the Provençals, who opposed the mercenary companies and did not want to give free passage for them toward Piedmont. In 1368, Urban V feared that Bertrand de Gascon's excommunication, because of the invasion of Comtat Venancy, would worsen the situation and asked the rector Philippe Cabassol not to use it unless it was necessary. Under Innocent VI and Urban V, a series of papal bulls condemned the excommunicated and excommunicated the companies between 1356 and 66. The first of these is the Ad Reprimendas Insolentias sent by Innocent VI to the city and diocese of Grenoble on the 31st July 1356. In this bull, the Pope pronounced excommunication and other civil penalties against the routiers. It mostly concerned the churches, monasteries, and hospitals of certain dioceses and the cities of Toulouse, Auch, Narbonne, and Arles. On the 27th February 1364, Urban V issued the Cogitnos bull for the destruction of Séguin de Badaful at Saint-Flour. The Miserabilis Nonnolorum was published 3 months after the Cogitnos bull for the Free Synodosche of Languedoc in order to provide a spiritual backup on the 27th May 1364. The Cogitnos is also strongly linked to the previous bulls, and its justification was rather defensive than punitive. The Clematadnos also replaced much of the Miserabilis Nonnolorum bull by excommunicating the members of the companies, concentrating on the leaders of the companies. On slide 12, we can see the expression used by the popes in relation to the mercenaries. The big difference between the other bulls and the Clematadnos is that the latest bull before the Crusades covered all of France. The background to this is already papal pressure, which was Urban V's attempt to persuade the mercenaries to leave for the Crusades. The bull was published on the 5th April of 1365, shortly before Charles IV's visit to Avignon. Preaching was the most successful part against the companies. In Fano, a commission was set up with the appointment of an inquisitor tasked with preaching a crusade against Conrad von Landau. Agostino Tinocci, Bishop of Narni, preached powerful sermons against the Conrad von Landau's Great Company in Florence in 1357. Every morning, the bells were rung and the Mass was celebrated. As a result of the preaching, 12 citizens paid the expenses of an armed cavalryman, and the sermons had the effect of bringing more than 1,000 florins a day into the coffers of the city. In 1 month, 30,000 florins were raised. Therefore, the Florentines managed to earn 700 barbuta. The crusading army in the service of the papal legate numbered 800 crossbowmen, 200 heavy armed horsemen, and 2,000 infantrymen. All this cost 100,000 florins. Against the mercenary companies occupying Pont-Saint-Esprit, sermons were preached in many cities of Europe, so that Cardinal Pierre Bertrand had a large crusading army at his disposal as well. The King of Aragon alone sent 600 men at arms and 1,000 infantry to the assembly of the crusade. Nevertheless, so too did contingents from Languedoc, Beaucaire, Gévaudan, Valais, Vivré, they contributed to the financing of the crusade. In addition, Bishop Aymon of Lausanne, who, according to the papal instruction on the 17th January 1361, levied a tax on all the clergy and monasteries of his diocese for the crusade against the Great Companies. However, the successful part of the crusade against the companies was over. The armies thus recruited never once encountered the companies, either in Italy or in the Kingdom of France. In all cases, the money raised was used to pay for the departure of the companies, preferring a peaceful solution to armed conflict. The legates in charge of the armies were probably right to assess the combat value of their crusading armies and not to risk an open battle. For example, the Great Company of Conrad von Landau was promised an immediate payment of 7,500 florins, with the remaining balance to be settled within a fortnight. Finally, in 1357, Conrad von Landau received 50,000 Florentine florins only to withdraw to Lombardy, paid by Pisa and Florence. Urban V, learning quickly from the above, decided already in 1363 to try a third option to solve the problem of the companies. If excommunication or crusades against them could not provide a lasting solution, he should use their formidable reputation, their many years of experience in various wars, and send them to fight the infidels. To do this, they had to be convinced in the first place, which could be achieved in several ways, as was seen in the case of Seguin de Badefol, by excommunication or by absolution. In the case of Arnaud de Servo, the mercenaries who took part in the crusade were given the same indulgence as those who took part in the crusades against them. The third way was persuasion. In 1360, the papacy tried its best to mobilize the companies in Italy and in the Kingdom of France for the cause. Saint Catherine of Siena, in a letter written 10 years after the events in 1375 to John Hawkwood, calls the English condottiero and leader of the companies that came in the time of hunger to stop killing Christians and turn his arms against the infidels engaged in the crusade. This tone of letter, the reasoning used by Saint Catherine, shows exactly how the Church was trying to persuade the mercenaries to take part in the crusades. From the outset, papal policy prioritized the active participation of the mercenaries in the crusades to be organized. There is ample evidence of this in the papal registers and in the European archives. From the very first moment when the cross was taken up in the Cathedral of Avignon on the 31st March 1363, Friday of the Holy Week, the involvement of the mercenaries was treated as a concrete fact. As early as May 1363, Avignon sent a letter to the captains active in the Kingdom of France and the neighboring territories, calling on them to take part in the crusade that had been announced. Urban V's letter is very instructive because it clearly shows the strategy of the Holy See. The Crusaders, headed by John the Good and Peter I, were joined by the mercenary companies. The Pope set two goals, the Turks and Saracens. However, the focus was clearly in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Saracens are mentioned only once in the letter, while the fate of the Christians in the Armenian kingdom, the Christians who were being overrun, and the captured cities and castles are analyzed at length. In the same way, the Pope describes in practical terms the background to the announcement of the crusade to the captains, also touching on the earlier successes and the journey of Peter I. It is clear from this that the purpose of the Passagium Generale was clearly determined by the strategic interest of Peter I. The Pope calls on the captains to prepare for the departure planned for March 1365 and to indicate their intention to participate to his envoy, Brother Nicholas Brohom of the Order of St. Augustine. He offered full absolution to members of the companies who decided to take part in the crusade. I quote, "For we, with paternal charity, zealous for your safety, will dedicate all the favor we can offer with diligent care." Another letter from the Pope dated the same day, 25 May 1363, also confirms the original idea of the Mercians taking part in the crusade under the French and Cypriot kings. According to the letter, Urban's Fifth crusading army would be composed of 200 French knights, 2,000 knights recruited from elsewhere in Europe, 6,000 infantrymen, and the members of the companies. Norman Huxley rightly concluded that if the companies refused to take part in the Passagium Generale, the whole enterprise would doom to failure because the nobles who would be willing to take part in the crusade would not leave France because they could not leave their lands behind unprotected. The Pope's initiative in 1363 was not yet well received by the routier in France. However, the first positive response from the members of the companies came in April 1364, and not from France but from Italy, from the company of Albert Sterz, one of the most influential condottieri of his time. Albert Sterz crossed the border between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire and arrived in northern Italy in 1361, where he fought in the service of Pisa in 1363. However, at the end of 1363, Albert Sterz was replaced by an English corporal, John Hawkwood, who was appointed as captain of war by the peasants. Soon afterwards, the members of the company followed the example of Pisa, and John Hawkwood was elected to head the company. Soon after this, Albert Sterz, in alliance with Johann Hanneken Bongard, founded the Company of the Star in 1365. However, when the war between Pisa and Florence was still going on in April 1364, the White Company of German, English and Hungarian mercenaries was still fighting in Tuscany along with Albert Sterz. The English members of the company held direct talks with Urban V just prior to a planned attack on Florence. Albert Sterz expressed an interest in participating in the crusade. This was the first time an envoy from a great company arrived in Avignon in connection with the crusade. On the 18th April 1364, Robert Woodhouse, an English nobleman, visited the Pope on behalf of the Societatis Anglicorum and informed Urban V that the members of the company were ready to take part in the crusade for the salvation of their souls. From his letter to Gilles d'Arbornos, it seemed that the news of the envoy of the White Company was very well received by the Pope. After the bad news in France, since it was in April 1364 that John the Good died, and the very idea of a crusade seemed increasingly remote due to the disinterest of the companies, Urban threw himself into the organization with renewed vigor and informed his Spanish legate that he would seek out other captains in Tuscany to see if they could be included in the venture. I quote, "We, therefore, noting that the other companies, which are those in those regions, we wish with all our heart to add significant aid to the recovery and liberation of Italy and the aforementioned company through a general passage." It is certain that Albert Sterz had a closer than usual relationship with Pope Urban V. The German condottiere had been in contact with Urban V since the summer of 1363 at the earliest, with the invoice passing in and out, exchanging letters on ongoing matters. In a letter addressed to Arberstadt on the 5th September 1363, the Pope wrote to the condottiere, I quote, and he, Gilles de Arbonos, knows that neither you nor the said company have offended the same church, but rather you are devoted to it and intend to be faithful and valiant defenders. End of the quotation. Hence, the papal policy and was set in motion, and within a month of Robert Woodhouse's visit to Avignon, concrete plans were beginning to take shape. The Pope, with the help of the English nobles such as William de la Pole, Lord of Ashby, and Thomas Ufford, son of the Earl of Suffolk, sought to ensure the widest possible participation of the companies who travelled to Avignon. A letter from the Pope to Thomas Ufford, dated 17 April 1364, reveals that they offered to Avignon to use their connections and recruit more English mercenaries fighting in Italy for the crusade. William de la Pole took the cross from the hands of the Pope in Avignon. In a letter dated the 9th May 1364, Urban V informs Joanna I, Queen of Naples, that the Lord of Ashby hopes to bring many of the English mercenaries active in Tuscany with him on the crusade. The plan was to pass through Otranto, subject to Joanna's permission, and supply of food for the troops. To facilitate the English crusaders crossing the Mediterranean, in a letter, Doge Lorenzo Celsi, dated 15 May 1364, he asked the Doge to make galleys available to the mercenaries recruited in Tuscany for the crusade. 4 days after the visit of Robert Woodhouse on the 18th April, Urban V issued a new bull to the White Company, thanking the members of the company for their willingness to take up the cross. I quote, here you see a part of the letter. Those with forgotten sins, upon confession, are granted for indulgence. Those who contributed or assist in various capacities in the crusade are also included in this indulgence. Participants in the crusade are protected from extraordinary collections or levies from the time of their departure until their return or demise. They are placed under the protection of the Church and its appointed leaders. Any transgressors against them face ecclesiastical censors. Creditors who forced the mercenaries to pay their debts were obliged to refund the sum to the debtors. If they do not comply, they will face ecclesiastical penalties. This bull was followed on the 20th April by another letter to the nobles of the White Company, who were entitled to carry a portable altar, and gave everyone the freedom to choose their own confessor. Pope Urban V, in a letter written to his legate Androin de la Roche on the 22nd June 1364, asks the legate to remove the companies raging in Tuscany because they are threatened papal lands, considering, I quote again, if they are not preparing to participate in general passage, end of the quotation, then the Italian cities should form a defensive alliance against those companies. From a letter to Bernabo Visconti dated 25th June 1364, we learn that the Pope informs the lords of Milan of their intention of another company to join. The company of Johann Hanneken Bongard wants to participate in the crusade with other unnamed companies. The latter reveals that the Viscontis have had preliminary discussions with the company about participating in the crusade. Since Johann Hanneken Bongard was close to Albert Sterz, it is likely that this close relationship played as much a role in the decision as it did for Arnaud de Serval a year later when he recruited the companies for his own crusade in the eastern France. Unfortunately, it is not known who and how many mercenaries Johann Hanneken Bongard intended to join up with. The latter is also important because it is the first evidence that the Holy See did not give up the idea of recruiting more companies after the death of John II of France. At the time, there were officially 9 months left until the planned date of the crusade, until March 1365. However, as expected, following the death of 2 important leaders of the crusade, the French king and the legate appointed by the Pope from Avignon, Cardinal Talleyrand of Périgord, in January 1364, the date of the crusade was delayed by several months. As it turned out, events unfolded in such a way that instead of the originally planned single crusade, 4 separate ones were carried out. The next important milestone in the recruitment of the mercenaries came with the Charles IV trip to Avignon. The imperial visit prompted a renewed effort by Urban V to implement his plan by sending companies from eastern France and Italy at the same time. By this time, Amadeus VI and Peter I, who had originally planned to carry out one crusade, had parted ways, and new plans were made to carry out 2 separate crusades. What is important here is that following Charles IV's visit to Avignon, Urban V sent a letter to Florence on the 9th June 1365 to arrange, after consultation with the emperor, for the mercenaries from Italy and France to march against the Turks. That is why the Pope wanted to organize a meeting in Bologna in order to facilitate the departure of the companies going overseas as effectively as possible. This letter is important because it links the plans for the various crusades that were to be carried out separately after the death of John the Good, and thus the plans of the companies leaving Italy with the crusade led by Arnaud de Serval. The mercenaries were scheduled to set off on a crusade crossing the Rhine at Strasbourg and continuing on to Hungary. However, if this did not happen, as the Pope had well foreseen, crusaders like Arnaud de Serval would turn south and meet Amadeus VI in Venice as they embarked. For this reason, the Pope asked Florence to send envoys to the White Company, led by Sir John Hawkwood, and persuade them to participate. In the meantime, Albert Sterz left the White Company, making the original participation of the company's members in the crusade a matter of doubt. William Caffero, in his book on John Hawkwood, gives details of the envoys. One of them was Doffo di Bardi, the son of the founder of the famous Bardi banking house, who had lived in London for years, knew Edward III personally, and spoke English. The ambassadors were given a difficult task because they had to negotiate the lowest possible amount to persuade the English condottiere to leave. According to William Caffero, Hawkwood toyed with the idea of taking part in the crusade, but eventually dropped the idea. Nevertheless, not everyone did. One of his former comrades in arms, Walter Leslie, actually took up the cross and joined his brother Norman with King Peter to Alexandria, where in all likelihood his brother Norman Leslie died. Between the start of the preparations for the Crusades and Peter I of Cyprus' departure from Venice in the summer of 1365, a series of obstacles emerged that prolonged the planned crusade. First of them were the Viscontis. In order to send the companies from Italy to the crusade, it was first all necessary to reach an agreement and peace with the lords of Milan. In a letter to Gilles de Albornoz, written on the 1st May 1363, the Pope informs the legate that Bernabo Visconti is willing to make peace with the Pope. During the negotiations, the Pope undertakes to suspend the excommunication. In a letter to the legate, written on the same day, he points out that John the Good and Peter I are sending envoys to Milan to persuade the Viscontis to reconcile. Eventually, Peter Tibor managed to negotiate a peace treaty, which led to the companies leaving Bologna. The peace was announced on the 20 January 1364. Under the terms of the agreement, Bernabo received 500,000 florins for vacating the Bologna area, to be paid in an annual installment of 62,500 florins over 8 years. This obstacle to the crusade was thus removed. Kenneth Seaton's research drew attention to 2 letters from Urban V, according to which Urban V did not trust Peter to participate in the Passagium Generale he had planned. A letter sent by Urban V on the 28th November 1363 reveals that the Pope had been informed that the Turks were planning to attack Cyprus and Antalya, which Peter had conquered in August 1361 during Peter's European journey. Peter is asked by the Pope, and I quote, "And pray you that you do not delay your return any longer, and may God help make it a fruitful return." End of the quotation. In fact, during Peter's European voyage, Cyprus suffered several such attacks. In the spring of 1363, Turkish raiders reached the shores of Cyprus at the same time as the plague was being broken out. Subsequently, the Cypriots led retaliatory attacks on the coast of Anatolia too. Urban believed that the king of Cyprus would return home in the spring of 1364. Peter's letter to the Florentines testifies that Peter set the date of the departure for the 1st March 1364, exactly 1 year before the crusade led by John II. This meant, of course, that the original planned crusade had already been split into 2 by the end of 1363, and Peter was to go on a separate campaign independently of the French king. The emergence of Amadeus VI in the preparatory phase of the crusade is closely linked to a new phenomenon: the involvement of the great companies in the crusade. After Amadeus had consolidated his power and successfully crushed the rebellion by 1362, his attention turned to the crusade. The Count of Savoy's interest in the crusade began when Pope Urban V tried to form an alliance against the great companies. However, the crusades against the mercenaries in France and Italy were unsuccessful. So the papal policy changed, and the excommunicated mercenaries became soldiers of Christ. These troops were to take part in a crusade led by the kings of France and Cyprus. Amadeus VI probably received the cross in January 1364 when he was personally present in Avignon. These troops were the initial plans were for the alliance was for the combined forces of King John the Good of France, King Peter of Lusignan of Cyprus, and the Count of Savoy to head for the Holy Land. On this occasion, the Count of Savoy founded his own chivalric order, the Order of the Color. On the 1st April 1364, Urban sent 10 letters to Amadeus VI concerning the crusade. In 8 of them, the Pope refers to Peter. The letters reveal that Amadeus was originally supposed to have fought with the Crusaders led by John the Good. Amadeus VI was in Avignon on the 1st January 1364 to attend a meeting on the planned crusade against the companies, where he agreed with the Pope to take up the cross shortly before Peter's planned departure. On the 2nd March 1364, Peter wrote a letter to Louis of Hungary reporting on the progress made so far. In the meantime, another obstacle emerged. A rebellion broke out in the Venetian-occupied Crete in early August 1363, and until Venice put down the rebellion, there was no question of any crusade, as the Republic needed all the galleys it could get to Crete. Venice also sent letters to Louis I of Hungary, Genoa, and Joanna to break off their relations with the rebellious Cretans. On the 11th October 1363, Doge Lorenzo Celsi informed Peter of Lusignan that a strong Venetian fleet was blockading Crete. He also asked the King of Cyprus to ban his subject from supporting the rebels. He pointed out that the rebellion would certainly delay the planned crusade. Urban V threw himself with great zeal into the settlement of the rebellion, seeing it as a direct threat to the planned crusade. Amadeus VI had been in constant contact with Philippe de Mézières since January 1364 and was thus kept informed on the preparations for a crusade. Philippe de Mézières writes from Cremona to Venice in January 1364, informing the Doge that he and the Green Count are ready to sail in March 1364 as agreed. In a letter to Doge offers to Peter and Louis that as he needs the ships to put down the rebellion, he can transport the crusaders, but only if they first stop in Crete and put down the rebellion. Philippe de Mézières arrives in Venice at the beginning of February and is confronted with the fact that the Venetians have, in the meantime, made a deal with Lucino dal Verme, so there is no question of a joint Cypriot-Savoy crusade. Although Amadeus had shown a willingness to participate in the suppression of the Cretan rebellion by informing Philippe de Mézières, that the later failed to convince the Doge and negotiations stalled. Meanwhile, in April 1364, the great companies appear on the western frontier of Savoy. But with Amadeus VI busy defending Savoy, preparations for the Crusades are delayed again. Thus, the possibility of a joint crusade by Amadeus VI and Peter I was lost. The Cretan rebellion delayed both crusades by a year until the summer 1365. Peter is on the move again in Europe, while Amadeus is now looking elsewhere for possible targets for his own independent crusade. From the autumn of 1364, at earliest, the Balkans and Asia Minor appear on the agenda. Amadeus' motivation is described in the chronicle from the early 15th century. According to the Chronicle Cabaret of 1418, the reason the Green Count chose the Balkans as the target of his crusade for King Louis of Hungary, here known as King Andrew, is to meet Amadeus in the Balkans. Hungarian influence over the parts of Serbia, Bosnia and Bulgaria brought Louis I closer to the Ottomans. Recognizing the danger, he signaled his intention to participate in the crusade that were about to begin. Thus, the Byzantine Emperor visited Buda, promising to comply with the Pope's instruction concerning the unification of the churches. Urban V considered the emperors untrustworthy for the time being, and in a letter to Louis, asked the Hungarian king not to support Byzantium. The Hungarian-Savoyan thread in the preparation of the Crusades is confirmed by another Savoyard chronicle, which reports on the envoys mediating between the Green Count and Louis, among others. I quote, "Thus he sent a knight to the Count of Savoy, informing him that his relative, the Emperor Alex of Constantinople, was captured and had lost a large part of Greece." End of the quotation. The chronicle suggests that there were several exchanges of envoys between Louis and Amadeus, since as early as September 1365, a Hungarian envoy arrived at the court of Amadeus VI. According to Nicholas Yorga, the Hungarian envoy was presented with a gift. In fact, the Green Count made up his mind when he heard that the Byzantine emperor had been refused to cross the territories controlled by Ivan Alexander of Bulgaria. The ambassadorial exchange mentioned by Servion may have taken place in May 1366. This is important because during the ambassadorial exchanges between September 1365 and May 66, when preparations for the crusade were well underway, and in the spring of 1366, when Amadeus was already on his way through Italy to Venice, he did so in the knowledge that he would be followed by the Crusaders led by Arnaud de Serval, and would lead a mercenary army of at least 10,000 men into the Balkans. According to Anton Bachbier, Amadeus VI left Venice a month after the death of Arnaud de Serval. It is possible that the Green Count's departure was closely linked to the news of what had happened to Arnaud de Serval. That is, his original intention may have been to wait for the arrival of the crusading companies. Only in June 1366, on learning of the death of Arnaud de Serval, did Amadeus VI hire mercenary companies before embarking at Venice. Amadeus VI had every reason to believe this. For the spring of 1365, Arnaud de Serval did his utmost to ensure that the companies that had returned to the county of Burgundy and the Duchy of Burgundy at the end of December 1365 would continue south towards Avignon and join the Savoy contingent in Italy. Amadeus prepared Savoy for the crossing of the companies with a series of orders. However, this was discussed in detail in the lecture on Arnaud de Serval's crusade. When Clara von Finstingen wrote her letter to Strasbourg about Arnaud de Serval's mercenaries, for first giving a concrete prediction of the size of the approaching Crusader army on the 27th June 1365, Peter of Lusignan boarded a galley in Venice and set sail for the east. According to Leonidas Markarias, the Cypriot king, with 33 ships set sail for the unknown destination. Peter kept the purpose of the crusade so secret that even the captains of the ships only learned of the fleet's final route on the high seas. The captains of the galleys bound for Alexandria, for example, only learned on the cruise's destination in a secret letter on the 4th September. This lecture had shown how difficult it was to prepare and organize a crusade in the mid-14th century, despite the fact that there was no lack of common will on the part of the European rulers and the papacy. The successful crusades against the mercenaries in Italy and in the Kingdom of France, as well as the enthusiasm of the nobles recruiting during the European journey of King Peter I of Cyprus, proved that there was still a social zeal and commitment to the Crusades. The problem was not determination, but a change in the political situation on the one hand, and the emergence of the great companies that radically changed late medieval warfare on the other, which fundamentally determined the success of such a crusade. As the western half of Europe was at war with each other. The Hundred Years' War in the second half of the 14th century was not limited to France, but extended by implication to Italy and the western provinces of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the Iberian Peninsula, including Portugal. Without the active involvement of the mercenaries, as was the case, it was impossible to organize a crusade because no one could leave their property unprotected. One of the defining features of the papal policy in the period of 1362-65, and more broadly in the second half of the 14th century, was the search for a response to the emergence of the great companies. Although papal policy did not achieve its ultimate goal, it did not succeed in either weakening the mercenaries in a sustainable way or in keeping them on the periphery of Europe fighting the infidels. The lecture has also demonstrated that even if it was not fair to be entirely useless by the contemporaries, the sack of Alexandria or the capture of Gallipoli gave rise to hopes that inspired the creation of a magnificent series of frescoes by Andrea di Buonaiuto showing the church militant and triumphant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very interesting again. As my previous occasion, I have to stress that I am absolutely like in these questions. So I have one perhaps naive question and one methodological question. My naive question that what was the historical memory of the national features of that century? I think that if you live in the 14th century and see back in last century, in the 13th century, you can find a country, I mean Hungary, which in some meaning a not too stable point nearby the Western Christianity. I mean Hungary in the 13th century in some meaning close to the Eastern Christianity. For example, it's a typical sign that there is two king whose name is András, which is a typical a name coming from Kiev Rus and so on. So it's not that, and if 100 years before Hungary was a kind of balance between the Byzantine Empire and Roman, I mean German Roman Empire. My question, but that's my first question, were there any feeling, suspicion or something concerning that type of country than Hungary between East and West, or in that time it was too far, it was a too far problem from this time? That's my first question. My second question that you show at the first part of your lecture several paintings from that century. My question is a general methodological question concerning the use of iconostas or any kind of that kind of pictures, that the icons and paintings in the temple show a kind of, how can I say, Zollenprinzip. So it's not a picture, I mean, not a photo about the contemporary situation, but a kind of normative thing. What is the balance within your sources of the pictures and the written texts?
For the first question, I would like you to clarify it again because I did not understand completely.
Okay.
What did you mean?
My question that if you see any part of German Empire or any part of Italy or any part of France, these countries and territories is absolutely clear on the side of the Western Catholicism.
Yes.
Hungary, till to the before the Anjou, so till to the end of 13th century, is a not clear country. I mean that in the 13th century or in the 12th century, it's a balanced country between Byzantium and Germany. In the 13th century, there is two king, the two Andrew king, which name is represent that they want to show something that we are close to the east. So my question, are there any suspicion toward that type of country than Hungary, or Hungary was from that viewpoint in the 14th century, it was a clearly West-oriented country?
Well, Louis I was he promoted the papal policy he was an ally of Urban V and before Innocent VI. So Urban V had counted on Louis on his endeavor to re-establish the papal authority in Italy. Actually, Louis I, for example, he was perhaps the only European king in the 1360s who sent a Hungarian army to Italy to help Gilles de Albornoz effort against the Viscontis in Milano. So Louis of Hungary was a profound ally, and Hungary was a part of Christendom. So it was not a question that Hungary would do any step without consulting Avignon in connection, for example, his policy toward the Byzantine Empire. And then, as I mentioned, when Pope Urban sent the letter to Louis of Hungary not to support the Byzantine Emperor, Louis of Hungary played his part according to the Pope's will. So there was not a...
so it means, as I understand, that since the Anjous belonged clearly to the Western world, it means that from the 14th century, Hungary belonged clearly to the Western Christianity, without any hesitation.
It was not... Yes, indeed.
I understand.
Yes.
Sorry for my naive question,
No, not at all.
That it was my impression that some months before I realized that there were no other king in Europe which were a Russian name as Andrew. And that was my shocking impression, that perhaps it means that okay, Arpad dynasty was a clearly Western oriented dynasty, but somewhere in the back they realized that the Eastern Christianity too close to not to orient at all to that way. That was my impression. That was the reason of my question. But as I understand, the Anjous was enough important to solve
it was one of Louis of Hungary was Urban Fifth, one of Urban Fifth major allies, who actively helped the papal policy in Italy.
Understand.
For the second question, the frescoes, the Via Veritatis in the Spanish chapel, what I mentioned, it is a novelty. It is my findings in during my research in Florence when I visited the Santa Maria Novella, and then looked up the literature and the research on the frescoes, the fresco cycle. There was no direct link. So there were two explanations of the creation of the fresco cycle, and identifying the members of Urban V and Charles IV and the rest of whom I talked about, and I think it is clearly fit into this theory of implementing the idea of implementing the joint crusades to get rid of the companies from France and Italy at the same time, and how successful the contemporaries thought that the two crusades led by Amadeus VI and Peter of Lusignan were. I think that only this is a particular case. So I did not see any other time when frescoes or paintings could have been involved in the research, in my research. However, I would like to pay the attention for Professor Attila Bárány's research group, who in Debrecen, who actively researching the trace of Hungarian mercenaries in Italy. And one of the way of searching for the evidences are in the Italian regarding the trace of the Hungarian mercenaries depicted in the different frescoes in Italy, in churches and other 14th century edifices. So I know that they are really putting an effort to not only to find the archival sources, but also these representations, what we talk about, on Hungarian mercenaries in Italy. So yes, actually it is a very good question, and actually there are now in Hungary research is going on in this aspect as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting for me too, who is a laik, but I hope that in the different part of the world it will be interesting for scholars of the medieval times.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.